Hello, everyone. I'm very excited today because we have with us Professor Arunava Sinha, who's one of the finest translators we have in our country at the moment, certainly. And he also happens to be a professor at Ashoka University and has to his credit over 60 translations. We'll be talking today about mostly about Khwabnama by Akhtaruzzaman Elias, but I forgot. I kept my copy in a copy of that book in Bhubaneswar. So at the moment, I don't have the copy, but I'm reading this translation, which is a collection of short stories, also translated by Professor Sinha. Great to have you on, Professor Sinha.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with talking about translation in general, because you're a student of English literature. You started out studying English literature. So I'm wondering what led you to consider translating regional texts into English?
Well, it was an awareness of the fact that many of the books that we read are actually not written in the language in which we read them. In my case, most of my reading was either in Bangla or in English. And in English, particularly, I discovered, well, I mean, we all should know, but it was still a point of discovery that many of the texts we were reading were not originally written in English. So then I started thinking about what it means to translate books from other languages. And that is what got my interest going. And then, like everything else that you're thinking about, you want to try your hand at it as well and try to figure out how it works, what you can learn from it. So that was how it all began for me.
Was there a particular text that perhaps led you to consider translation?
Well, it wasn't so much a particular text that I thought of translating as a particular text that made me think of translation, which was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This was soon after Garcia Marquez had won the Nobel Prize, and the books became available in India, in Calcutta, where I lived. And reading it for the first time, I became really conscious of the fact that someone had taken the words from Spanish and put them in English and made them memorable. The lines that we used to quote and the lines that we used to reread with so much pleasure were actually not written by Garcia Marquez at all in the technical sense, but by Gregory Rabassa, his translator. And yet we were thinking correctly that we were reading Garcia Marquez. So that's what a fantastic job a good translator or a great translator can do. They can make you think that you are reading the writer of the first version of the text, although you're not technically.
At the same time, I struggle to sort of differentiate between good translation and bad translation because I do not have specific answers to that question. As in, I know when a translation is good or bad. It depends on how it makes me feel, but I have no comparative method or analogy. If I don't know the language, if I don't know the two
No,
languages.
I think it is incorrect to measure the worth of a translation in terms of its relationship with the language from which it's been translated, because that's a technical form of reading. That's not how we read. We read a text the way it is, and the text either gives us joy and pleasure or not. It either makes us feel deeply or not, and that is the measure of a good text. And if you just remember that what you're reading is a translation, then automatically a great text is a great translation, because it is a great text in the version in which you're reading it, and it is a translation. So that makes it a great translation. That's all there is to it. It isn't about checking whether the words are accurately rendered and so on. That's not how anyone reads.
The question is also of the essence of the text. I think some translators try to imbibe the essence of the text, but I wonder whether that is the correct approach uh, to the text, because if you read like Indian languages, some words, some phrases are completely untranslatable to an English reader without the cultural context. So for recently, I was reading a novel by Gopinath Mahanti where there are 2 pages which are literally based on the phrases tume and apana, which is tum or aap would be in Hindi. And there is no equivalent of that in English. So to translate that into English would be very difficult, and to erase that would also be wrong, because it occupies literally 2 to 3 pages of the text, and it's a playful conversation. So I'm wondering, do you think a translation is supposed to retain the spirit? As Ray said, that he retained the spirit of Vibhuti Bhushan when he was adapting the movie, but the it was not the exact faithful translation as such. And you can do that in movie, but can you do that with the text?
Well, I'm not sure what these words mean actually, essence and spirit and so on. These
Mm-hmm.
are very abstract words and they probably mean different things to different people. I am very, very skeptical of any effort to locate the essence of a text. A text by its very nature is rich, it is polyphonous, it means many things. It cannot be reduced to a single essence. If you do, you're doing a great disservice to a great book. If anyone tells me that XYZ book, let's say Gopinath Mohanty's book is, and that phrase is used nowadays, what is this book about? And my answer to that always is, this book is about nothing. It is no book, no great work of art is about one thing or two things or three things. You cannot reduce it. The job of a translator is not to see what a text can be reduced to by way of essence or to subscribe to essentialism, but to actually see what all the different forms of richness that it can provide are, and capture all of them in multiple voices and tones and timbres in the translated text. So that's point one. Point two, as far as the spirit is concerned, again, I have no idea what that means. I know that you cannot translate a text into a film in a sort of word for word, phrase by phrase way, because, for instance, the new medium does not allow you to do things that the old medium does. For instance, in cinema, you cannot capture a person's thoughts unless you cop out and use a voiceover or something, right? So you have to find a visual language for a person's thoughts, which automatically means that you are using a medium and stretching it and playing with it in a way that goes beyond words. Now, it's the same when you're taking a text from one language to another. If the language into which you're translating cannot accommodate certain ideas that exists in the original culture in which the text is rooted, then you have to create them. And your example of what in Bangla for me would be apni and tumi, while English as we know it, or as many people know it, does not have differentiate between these two forms of the second person, you can easily make it happen by using your text appropriately. You can easily invent things. A language into which you're translating can be extended. So English can be Odiaified or it can be Bengalified for the duration of their translation. After all, if whoever is reading only wants to read a text in pure English, they might as well read a text that was always written in English. So if they're reading a translation, you can give them these other elements that are borrowed from other languages. It's eminently possible. So I don't consider any text untranslatable. It is a matter of the translators and the readers' imaginations working together. Having said that, will the reader read exactly the same text? No. But then does the reader read exactly the same text even in the language in which a text is written? Will your reading of a Gopinath Mohanty book be the same as mine? Of course not, because we bring ourselves into our reading.
But
And
that
that's
would
what
be subject to interpretation, right?
it's not
So
just a matter of
I
interpretation.
think the problem is when we talk about essence, it becomes about interpretation, which is not uh, not a translation, because it limits the author, it limits the reader from making, it limits the sort of interpretation that a reader can make. So would you say that the purpose of a good translation would be to allow the reader to have to make as many interpretations on their own as the original does?
Exactly. In fact, I even have a problem with the use of the word original. Why do we call it the original?
Uh,
It is a
you're cutting
version.
off. Can you just repeat?
I have a problem with the use of the word original.
Um,
Can you hear me?
cannot hear you.
Well, my network is fine.
Yes, 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 yes.
Okay. So I was saying that I have a problem with the word original. I think we make too sacred a thing of something called the original. It is chronologically the first version in words. It's not the original. The original is something that lies perhaps in the author's head. and in the collective imagination of the culture from which a text originates. Then that gets translated into words in one language. It might be Bangla, it might be Odia, it might be English, it might be anything. Then those words are further translated into other languages. So it's continuously, writing is a process of translation and translation is a process of translation. And the whole idea is to offer all the potential, you're absolutely right. If a text can be interpreted in 20 different ways in one language, you must be able to create the opportunity for the reader to interpret it in 20 different ways in another language as well. So it is not the translator's job to interpret or to explain or to simplify or to get to the essence of anything. The translator's job is to create exactly the same possibilities in across all languages.
In Khwabnama, you have retained certain Bengali words, like matcha. So I think, so how do you decide which word is important enough to be retained and which word isn't? Is it?
It's not a matter of what is important enough. It's a question of whether it's too much trouble to invent a word for it. When you end up inventing a word that will continuously alienate the reader, make them wonder what's going on here, then it doesn't serve the purpose. And a word like matcha, once you've explained it, you can stealthily explain it the first time around, and then the reader knows what it is.
So coming to the text Khwabnama, first of all, tell us a little bit about the author, about Akhtaruzzaman Elias.
No, I'm no expert on Akhtaruzzaman Elias.
As in a background, because I
That's a
think
question better asked to experts on Akhtaruzzaman Elias's work. I know as much about him as anybody who will read him up on the net. I don't know any more than that.
So what led you to translate Khwabnama?
It's an outstanding work and one of the greatest books to have been written in the Bengali language in the past 50 years. So if you have a chance to translate such a book, you would never turn it down. The bigger question is whether you feel you are ready for it or not. It took me a long time to feel that I was ready to translate it.
But it's a work of epic proportion, and some have described it as untranslatable. Did that sort of thought daunt you at first?
No. I mean, people always describe anything they love very much as untranslatable because they think that it should exist only in that form and in no other form. Imagine if the Russians had said Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are untranslatable, then we would never have had their literature. So I find this concept completely alien and completely opposed to how do you get the literature of one part of the world across to readers in another except through translation? So what they mean is it's difficult. Of course, it's difficult, but that doesn't make it untranslatable.
So in Khwabnama, the Tebhaga movement is always in the background, but it never comes to the forefront.
Yeah.
And the sort of the great man theory, as it were, all of the great men are kind of ignored, and the focus is on the subaltern, on their lives, and
Yeah.
their daily lives, in fact, not even the oppression. Do you think
That's,
Elias, it's an attempt to sort of subvert the great man theory and give a voice to the subaltern?
I don't know. I really don't know. I wouldn't aim to double guess the writer ever, and certainly not what Akhtaruzzaman Elias was thinking. I think it's up to the reader. If that is how readers see it, then that interpretation is valid. If some other reader sees it another way, that interpretation is valid as well. So there is no one answer to this question, right?
Right. The partisan also plays, it plays a crucial role towards the end of the novel, but there's a build up to that throughout the novel.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, we know how the narrative of partisan differs from, say, Punjab and Bengal, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering how the narrative differs from, say, West Bengal and East Bengal. Is there a difference between the narrative between the two states?
I'm sure there is, but I don't think Akhtaruzzaman Elias's book is the one where you will necessarily find the answers to that. But it depends on who's writing. So that determines the perspective. So the same incident, when looked at from multiple sides, will obviously look different. So anyone who's looking at it from a space where, for example, if you're looking at it from the perspective of um, people who moved out of what is now West Bengal to what is now Bangladesh, then you'll get one kind of version of the stories. If you look at it from the perspective of people who moved in the reverse direction, you'll get a different kind. So every perspective is correct. There is no one definitive thing, right? Whether it's history or whether it's literature, it depends on who's telling the story.
In the writing, I found that it was that the narrative itself is different from a lot of other regional works that I've read. There was a certain, uh, I think it is what Edward Said would call the late style because of the maze-like narrative that it has. So I'm wondering whether Eliot was inspired by any sort of international writers. Did he have any influence, crucial influence for this book?
I'm sure he did. He was a professor of English, and he was an erudite person. He was widely read. He was reading the literatures of the world, and every writer is affected in some way by what they're reading. That is why they read. Why else would you read? We are always telling young people who want to write that you must read 100 books for each book that you want to read. So why that you want to write? So why do we tell them to read? Obviously, it is to learn. It is to absorb. So every writer reads in order to be able to get something out of the text that they're reading. And I'm sure Elias was no exception.
But also the originality of the writing style, because it's different from other regional writing. So I'm wondering if you found in Bengali literature any other text with a similar sort of narrative or writing style, or the themes.
I don't know about similarity of writing style. I don't think that is possible. But certainly there are plenty of writers who don't necessarily write in a linear fashion, or who don't necessarily write in a way that is only aimed at conveying information. But having said that, Elias's writing style is not so much to do with the surface of his text, which is actually, if you take any random paragraph or random chapter, will not be particularly quote unquote difficult. But it is the way he creates the entire matrix that makes it a very complex tapestry and not a straight line from point A to point B. There are many writers, notably Navarun Bhattacharya is one I can think of from India, who writing in Bangla, who wrote in similar fashion, in the sense of lots of complexity in the way the story is told, lots of as a matter of fact, Navarun was a far more self-indulgent writer, in that he put in a lot more comment, observations, meta information, and so on. Akhtaruzzaman Elias was far more disciplined. If you read Khwabnama, or if you read Chilekota Shepai closely, you will not find a single sentence that you can take away and nothing will change.
The of magical realism, but the kind of magical realism which is different from the normal magical realism that we witness. Like there,
Sorry, your voice is
into the
breaking.
water.
I'm not able to hear you clearly, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me?
No, I only caught the phrase magical realism. I didn't catch anything else.
Hello.
Yeah, can we continue?
My apologies, it's the internet connection.
No problem.
Um, where were we? Yeah, we were talking about magical realism.
Yeah,
So,
I didn't catch your question.
so in a Elias world, I found that the magical realism, if we can term it as such, he uses is very different from the normal, in the normal sense of the word. In the way it's used in the conventional magical realist text, there is no abrupt shift. There is no clear division between the world of magic and the world of the real. It kind of converges. And I'm wondering if magical realism for Elias is a tool to transport the reader into the world of the subaltern, because he uses because the magical realist terms that he uses, ghosts, myths, and legends, uh, they're they're real for the people living inside them. So it is to give us a perspective of how they live. He's using it as a sort of narrative device. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, when I read the book, I never felt for a moment that there was any magical realism in it. Elias is just presenting the lives of the people who he's writing about in the book, and he's presenting their thoughts and their collective memories and their imaginations and their histories, the way they consider them. And it may be the ultra rationalist Western gaze that separates some elements out of this and calls it magical and the rest of it realism. As far as the people themselves are concerned, it's all real, as you rightly said. So that's all he's doing. There's nothing particularly, I don't even think of it as a narrative device or anything especially artful, and which is why he makes no hard distinction. This is exactly the entire life of the people whom he's talking about, and so it's seamless.
Also, I think, um, am I audible?
Yeah, I can
I'm
hear you.
sorry because my voice is breaking and I cannot hear you.
I can hear you.
All right. So I think because uh, he uses ambiguity in it, because a lot of the times you feel that the ghost is visible to some people and it's not visible to others. Like Tamir's father in a scene towards the end where he talks to Kulsum is not visible to people around her, but it's clear to Kulsum that the ghost of Tamir's father is real. And similarly for Vaikuntha, the legend of Majnusa and Bhavani Pathak is real in that sense. So it becomes a kind of a book of dreams, but also a book of shattered dreams, because towards the end, almost everyone's dreams sort of become shattered. The realization that Tamiz is going to get a larger share of crop never identifies. Most of the characters die. So, what do you think? Uh, he used the idea of dream to symbolize this. Do you think he was referring to it as a sort of broken ideal, or it was a diagnosis of what went wrong?
I'm very loath to make these jump to these conclusions. I think every reader needs to read a magnificent text like this in their own way and draw their own symbolism. I wouldn't like to say that this is what it means, or this is what it symbolizes, or this is what it exemplifies. He's created a vast, beautiful, glorious, rich board, a huge canvas with a lot of colors and a lot of patterns and designs and so on. It's up to us to make what we want to of them. So what you're describing is absolutely right from your point of view. Another reader may see something else in it may resonate with them. I wouldn't say that this is more right than that. I'm very reluctant to apply the tools of literary analysis as a reader, and especially as a reader who translates.
Right. So, in the text, it ends and starts to the same sort of refrain. There is, it's written in a kind of poetic language, and there is a refrain which keeps repeating throughout the text, which gives it a sense of feeling that it's epic. And I find that similar in a lot of traditional literature. So I'm wondering, was there any particular traditional style of writing which he bases this book upon? Did he consult? Because there are references to Pothisuklars and things like that.
I really wouldn't know. As I said, as a translator, if you study a writer too much, then you get very confused, and then you don't know what it is you're trying to translate. You suddenly feel you're translating 50 different things and not the text alone, which is a very dangerous place to be in for a translator. So I don't study text or the writer in that manner. I really wouldn't know where he drew his inspiration from, whether the style is entirely his own or whether he's borrowing structures from anywhere. For me, as a translator, what matters is what I see in the text.
Do you have, what do you think is his place in the canon of world literature? Because I've heard literary critics mention that he's one of the finest writers in the world who is often ignored because his texts have not been translated.
Well, only time will tell, and if it is read by readers around the world, only then will we know. Otherwise, as long as he remains imprisoned, even in after a translation in English, if he remains imprisoned only on the subcontinent, then no one will find out. And while we can easily make say that yeah, he is one of the finest writers, which I strongly believe he is, and that this is one of the finest books in world literature, which I strongly believe it is, it will still need a lot of readers from around the world to read and agree.
Uh,
Otherwise, that's a sort of it's a position which no one is aware of, so it makes no difference.
yes, I think the regional literature of the subcontinent in India has not received as much attention as, say, English literature from India, say Salman Rushdie or Amitav Ghosh has received. So, because we have a lot of gems like these in the subcontinent in regional literature. So, do you think that there is a sort of uh, disconnect between what the English world perceives our literature to be and what regional literature actually is?
I'm very loath to call it regional literature, because
Yeah, I
would you call French literature, German literature regional literature? So no, it's not regional. It is one of the many literatures of this part of the world. The thing is that the world over, in the modern world, there is a great disconnection between literary quality and what readers read, simply because the mediation or the gatekeeping is done by corporate entities whose motives, while they may have some proportion of desire to publish great literature, their primary motive is business. And as long as it's not about whether that's a good motive or a bad motive, but that particular motive is not in sync with the motives of creating great literature or great art of any form. Therefore, naturally, the decisions that are taken of what to publish, how much to put the word out about it, how aggressively to take it to people, are not in sync with the quality of the work. They're in sync with what the work can do for the company in terms of revenues and eventually profits. So naturally, there's a disconnection, right? Today, if Indian writers in English are getting more attention from publishers, it is because they had become brand names and household names, but that is dwindling now. The new crop of writers in English do not get the same kind of attention. And interestingly, translations from the non-English Indian or subcontinental languages are now rising to the top of the field. They are moving to the center and pushing out a lot of English writing to the margins. So there's an interesting churn taking place for sure.
Yes, sir. As evidence to the example of the Tomb of Sand, which recently won the Man Booker Prize, or for that matter, the JCB prize, which incentivizes a lot of these translations. So do you see do you think it's the same for translation as well, as in if you want to translate a marginal text versus if you want to translate a text that is in the canon, which everyone has heard of, something like Tagore or Vibhuti Bhushan. Is it easier for you to get a publisher if you translate uh, figures which are popular versus figures which are perhaps no one has heard of outside of Bengal?
Yeah, well, there is great interest now in publishing um, relatively unknown writers, especially if they belong to the social and gender margins. I don't know how long that particular desire on the part of publishers will last. I hope it lasts for a long time. But again, I suspect it is not really powered by a desire to publish from the margins, but it is powered by an inkling that maybe books from the margins will sell more copies, which inevitably is a transitory kind of trend. So that's the scene today. I don't know what it'll be like 2 or 3 years from now, what will capture publishers' interest. But it is undoubtedly true that there are so many layers between great books and the reading public that there a lot of distortion happens along the way. Yeah, I don't have more to add to that.
I'm sorry, I just, because your voice is cutting off, so I'm not this voice. All right, what are the translations that you would recommend everyone to read from the subcontinent?
Read modern Malayalam literature in translation. All they're fantastic books, all of them. Read Urdu books in translation. Very great works coming out of Urdu, modern Urdu writings. Marathi, Kannada. These are the four languages I would say there should be a lot of attention on. Hindi certainly. There's a lot of new, feisty, modern, very contemporary Hindi writing that is not really getting the attention of readers outside of Hindi because it is not being translated enough. So I would recommend these. Yeah.
Is there anything that you're working on at the moment? Any translation or any work?
There's always something that I'm working on at any point of time. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, there are 3 books that are coming out early next year, which are complete and lying with publishers. One of them is a novel by Mahashweta Devi called The Murderer's Mother. One of them is a novel by an Australian writer of Bangladeshi origin called Sania Rushdie. The book is called Hospital. And the third one is a collection of essays by the writer Shankar, a sort of memoir. They add up to a kind of memoir. So these 3 are currently lying with publishers.
What would be your advice for would-be translators?
Read a lot in both the languages, the language from which you translate and the language into which you translate. Listen, don't just read with your eyes, but read with your ears, and practice. Practice translating all the time. It's like singing. Riyaz is essential, performing is essential, but also studying, reading, listening to other people's singing is essential. So in the same way, you have to read enormously in the language from which you're translating, read everything, read across periods, across genres, read enormously in the language into which you're translating, again, across periods, across writing styles, across genres, and listen. Listen to the books you're reading, listen to people talking in real life, eavesdrop on conversations, because that is how you will discover how people really talk and how stories are really told.
What do you think? Where do you think the voice of the translator comes into the text? Because translation, I think, is to someone who, say, engages in creative writing, who engages in stories or writes novels. Translation could be a bit constrained if you're working on a translation, because then your duty becomes translating the voice of the original into a different language. Is there any place for the voice of the translator in the text at all?
Not consciously. Because none of us can avoid unconscious um, participation of our creative skills, but certainly consciously, no, the translator has no business being present. Although they end up being present simply because you will choose one word and I will choose another for the same word, right? Let's say from Odia. And neither of us will be wrong, but because we are different persons, we are inserting ourselves in there in some way. But not, it should not be a conscious process. Um, Other than that, I don't agree that writers cannot be translators. There are some very fine writers who are very fine translators also. Haruki Murakami is one example. A lot of writers in Bangla were all translators. And I think a great writer is perfectly able to subsume their own voice and echo the voice of another person. That is what being a great writer is all about. It's not as though a good writer or a great writer will write in the same voice in every book that they write. Yeah, they will also be varying their voices. So therefore, they're perfectly capable of putting on somebody else's cloak.
Also, I think because we discussed a bit about, the term regional literature itself, I think that term comes in because a lot of the literature from one state does not disseminate into other states, because there is very few translation within Indian languages. There
Yeah,
are
there are no
many,
translators. That's why.
there are major translators in.
Yeah, big lack of translators. That's the problem.
So how do you think one can maybe battle that? Because for I think it's important to understand, to have the same literary figures as national figures. We need to know each other's literature, and it's English is accessible only to few people, right? So I think there needs to be some sort of incentive for interregional translation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. We need to do that. My colleague, Professor Rita Kothari, and I have started the Ashoka Center for Translation at Ashoka University. And that is exactly what we are hoping to be able to foster, a culture of translation across and between the non-English Indian languages.
I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the historically speaking, there was a lot of interregional translation when the movement began. I am, as I'm aware of Odia literature in that sense, that a lot of Odia writers of that time, like Fakir Mohan Senapati, one of the earliest Odia novelists, he translated a lot of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's writings into Bengali, and there was a lot of Radhanath Ray also engaged in both Bengali and Odia literature. So there was a lot of that in, I think, when modernity came in. But as a movement, because the states are sort of completely formed, and because none of us know, if very few of us are aware of each other's languages, it's not as much valid.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. It was very strong and robust, so much so that many writers, many readers in the southern states of India did not know that Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay was actually a Bengali writer. They assumed that he wrote in their own language. So that has completely died, and we need to really bring back that momentum.
Hopefully, we will.
Yes.
Professor, I had a great time talking with you, and sincere apologies for the uh, technical difficulties. I can't help it. All right, everyone watching, like, share, and subscribe.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks again.